it's you've got to understand that, like in the world of rock and roll, there are certain changes that sometimes occur, and you've just got to sort of roll with them. I mean, you read that. You saw exactly how many people have been in this band over the years. 37 people have been in this band over the years.
So what happens to the band now?
Hello everybody and welcome to another video. This one is kind of a response to vinyl collector James, who has recently done an extremely good video about the situation which stands between Lindsey Buckingham and Fleetwood Mac at the moment. So James did a really impassioned video, very, very articulate. It was one of the most articulate and emotional videos I've ever seen on the VC. I strongly urge you to check it out. I'll put the link up there. And what James was talking about was this kind of, well, there's a very particular bit of politics which has gone down between Fleetwood Mac and Lindsey. I'm not actually party to the ins and outs of it. James has a theory about what's happened, so go and check out his video to have a look. I don't have any kind of insights into what's gone on there, but the upshot is that they've kind of announced a big tour and so on, and then all of a sudden Lindsey is out of the band and they're getting Tim Finn from Crowded House to replace him, along with Mike Campbell from Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. And James is fairly upset about this, and he was urging people not to buy tickets and so on. And so it got me thinking about maybe doing a video about a topic which has long been on my mind. And in fact, a long time ago I did try and record a video about it and it didn't work out too well. So I thought this would be a good hook to hang it on. And it's just this idea of when bands kind of maybe go one step too far in trying to prolong their career. You'd have seen from the thumbnail of this video a photograph of AC/DC featuring Axl Rose from Guns N' Roses, and if I've found the right picture, it'll be him in a wheelchair. Now, AC/DC are one of those bands who had lots of lineup changes through the years. They lost their original singer Bon Scott, who died tragically. They got Brian Johnson in, which reinvented the band. And sort of turned them into something else. They became more of a heavy metal band, arguably, rather than a kind of barroom bluesy heavy rock band, which they'd been with Bon Scott. And then they started to lose drummers, and in fact it was just drummers really. Malcolm Young stayed with them almost to the end as rhythm guitarist, but then he got ill and so on. And Phil Rudd, the drummer, got replaced a couple of times. And personally, I don't think the AC/DC without Phil Rudd sounds right at all, but that's another story. So AC/DC are an example of a band who kind of, they continued and it turned into a saga, and eventually, arguably, it kind of went too far, and we had Axl Rose joining AC/DC. And at that point you have to ask yourself, well, what is the essence of this band? And I think, going back to James's video, James very much located the abiding spirit of Fleetwood Mac in the talent of Lindsey Buckingham. And I suppose what I want to say in this video is that this is all largely a matter of perception. It's what do the fans perceive as being the essence of a band, and how bothered are they ultimately by lineup changes? So there are some people who are not that fussed, and they're quite happy to hear the music being sung by Tim Finn and the guitar being played by Mike Campbell. There are other fans like James who are totally horrified by this. And I suppose on one level you could argue that there's no kind of right or wrong as far as the band is concerned. The band has the ultimate right, perhaps, to decide what they want to do. But it's easy to get outraged by these things, and I have been in that situation before. I mean, ideally you want a band, don't you, to always have the same people in it. I mean, there are a few really notable examples of bands who managed to do that. You had the Beatles, who were always four guys. There was some talk at one point in their career when George, walked out one day and John said, let's just get Eric Clapton in, and there was some talk of Paul McCartney being replaced by their German friend Klaus Voormann, which never happened. It's incredible to envisage what might have happened had that happened, but that was not the case. Another great example is Led Zeppelin, who decided, quite admirably I think, that the essence of their band was the drummer, which is a fairly unusual route to take. It's certainly not one that The Who took. I mean, Keith Moon died and The Who carried on, still called themselves The Who. But when John Bonham died, they just decided, well, the spirit of the band has gone, and they never really did reform. I mean, they did a couple of one-off gigs, but they never really got back. I think Jimmy Page wanted them to, but I think, well, there was all sorts of politics with that band. It was a very complicated story. But essentially, they broke up when the drummer died. They decided not to go any further. So there's Led Zeppelin. There's also bands such as The Jam, who were always just the three guys. There is REM, almost made it. Their drummer decided to leave, and they staggered on for a few albums after he'd gone. U2 kind of always managed to stay the same. But in general, these bands are kind of the exceptions, I think. And what sprung to mind when I was watching James's video, I was applauding James's passion and his very articulate argument, with which I agreed, actually, in the case of Fleetwood Mac. But at the same time, I was thinking, well, this is really nothing new. Bands have always done this. There's so many soap operas in the world of, you know, band lineups and politics, and Fleetwood Mac were the ultimate example. And what I really liked about James's argument was this thing, well, yeah, okay, this band has had loads and loads of lineup changes through the years, some really big lineup changes. I mean, when Lindsay Buckingham and Stevie Nicks joined the band, it was a total reinvention of that band. But that was during the band's youthful period, where they were still kind of trying to make it. It becomes different, so the argument goes, towards the later stages, when all the money has been made and the career has basically happened and has got as big as it's ever going to be. And then they try and stagger on well past their sell-by date, you know. So now is not the time to be replacing Lindsay Buckingham. So this argument goes, you know, why not just say, well, let's just call it a day. Just like AC/DC didn't, they could easily have said, no, you know, the essence of the band has gone. We've lost Brian Johnson. We've lost Phil Rudd. I mean, you know, to lose Brian Johnson and then to get Axl Rose in from Guns N' Roses, you have to ask yourself, what was the bottom line motivating them there? I mean, maybe loads of tickets had been sold for the gig, I don't know. But again, it's all to do with where do bands locate the essence of their own sound? And you might think, well, AC/DC, maybe, ultimately, Angus Young has decided, well, I am the band. One example of that is Black Sabbath, which started as a very, very, I'd say, Beatlesy kind of concept, with four guys from a very working class environment and background, and they had a very specific sound with, you know, Ozzy on vocals, and there was a great deal of reality to that band. And they weren't really a heavy metal band, they were just a kind of hard rock band who were channeling their experience into their music of being working class lads from a particular city in the Midlands in the UK. But then, you know, they had so many lineup changes, and once Ronnie James Dio came in, it turned into more of a kind of theatrical heavy metal band, and then there was Ian Gillan a bit later, and there were so many lineup changes until in the end, Tony Iommi was the only guy who had been there all the way through. So I think with that band, at some point down the line, Tony Iommi, it became clear in Tony Iommi's mind that Black Sabbath was just basically him and whoever he was going to work with. He could easily have dropped the Sabbath name, but he just chose to carry on using it. And frequently, of course, that's because bands want to continue trading on the name which has made them big. Another example being Pink Floyd. When Syd Barrett left, a bit like Fleetwood Mac, they were still building their career and they were still trying to get somewhere, and you know, so there was no possibility of giving up at that point. Roger Waters took over as the main lyricist and conceptualizer and led them through this astonishing body of work in the 1970s, and they made all this money, and then Roger decided to leave the band. I mean, that was a very tricky situation. He kind of misplayed his cards, really, because he thought the band would break up, and then what happened? David Gilmour decided, no, actually Pink Floyd is my guitar playing. Essentially, that's what he kind of, you know, that was the gesture. Pink Floyd is my voice, my guitar playing. That's what I've done for the last X number of years. I'm going to carry on. And you know, I went to see Pink Floyd in 1987 on the Momentary Lapse of Reason tour. I didn't miss Roger Waters. The other band that I want to talk about actually is Queen, because they sort of managed to get all the way through their career with just four guys in the band, and then one of them died, Freddie, and I think they rightly looked at themselves and thought, we can't carry on, because Freddie was such a huge presence in that group, and his talent and his voice and everything about him was so intrinsic, But then what they did is that they left it several years, and then they started to think, well, let's get back, and they got Paul Rodgers in, whose voice was totally unsuited to most of the Queen material, and now they've got this other guy, Adam Lambert, and I find that a very odd situation, because imagine if Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr decided to go out and call themselves the Beatles, and they justified it in the way that Queen have done by saying we are not the Beatles, we are the Beatles plus, so we call ourselves the Beatles plus, whoever, just get some guy in to sing, do John's bits, and then when people say to them, oh, it's disgraceful that you're calling yourselves the Beatles, they say, aha, we're not the Beatles, we're the Beatles plus. Would Brian May and Roger Taylor approve of that? Maybe they would. I mean, I saw an interview with Roger Taylor where he basically said, you'd be crazy if you had a brand name like Queen, you'd be crazy not to use it. And I read that interview and a kind of light bulb went in my head, and I thought, right, yeah, he no longer sees Queen as a band, he now sees them as a brand. And this is exactly what James was talking about in his video. When bands become brands, essentially you reach a point where it doesn't sort of matter who's in the band. And I'm afraid, as we get further and further out of that kind of classic era, as we move further away from the 1970s, further away from the 1980s and the 90s, when it all kind of meant something, it's almost as if the music is becoming more like classical music, where it doesn't really matter who is playing it as long as you go and get to hear it. And I had lots of debates with Queen fans on various forums where they were saying things like, oh, it doesn't matter who's playing the music, it's just the music I want to hear. And I think you'll find with Fleetwood Mac, that's the argument that a lot of people will come out with. I don't care that it's not Lindsay, I just want to hear the music live, and I'm sure that Tim will do a great job of the vocals. It's only people like James, Vinyl Collector James, and people like me who care about those things. Lots of people don't care about them, and that's why you still get thousands and thousands of people going to see Pink Floyd without Roger Waters, going to see Queen without Freddie Mercury, going to see Fleetwood Mac without Lindsay. Genesis, another example, they had all these lineup changes and it all worked great, and then one lineup change too many. That was never going to work. They tried to stagger on. I've not really come to any conclusions in this video other than to just explore the topic a little bit and maybe kind of open it out to people now, and go and check out James's video. And then if you want to make another video in response to this, how do you feel about this? Is there a difference between the Beatles and Queen? Why is it okay for Queen to be just half the band and still call themselves Queen, but it's not okay for the Beatles to do that? Why are Queen different from Led Zeppelin? Why do Brian May and Roger Taylor? I mean, it's not all about Queen. I mean, don't get too focused on that. But all these other bands that I've talked about, Genesis, Black Sabbath. Is Black Sabbath just Tony Iommi? Well, not anymore, because he's back with Ozzy and he's back with Geezer again, although not with Bill Ward, the drummer. And Black Sabbath have been a bit like Spinal Tap over the years with all the drummers, but that's another story. I mean, they had Bev Bevan from ELO on drums at one point. Was he a member of Black Sabbath, or was that just that strange period where Tony Iommi was doing a solo career and he was still calling his band Black Sabbath? It's quite a controversial topic, and there'll be people with lots of different beliefs and opinions and persuasions, which I thought was why it would be interesting to open it out a bit from James's initial video. But do check out that video, because it was great, and I think it's always good to see somebody with a lot of passion arguing vehemently that the band which is now out there calling itself by whatever that name is no longer that band in reality, and they should maybe have some more artistic integrity and either call it a day, call themselves something different, whatever, So anyway, that's it for now. Hope you enjoyed the video. Comments below, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.
What do you mean?
He's not coming back, or?
No, we shan't work together again.